Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Alex.
And for this episode, we're going in the science more broadly direction of the topics that we cover. We're going to be talking about global science and the history of how nations have interacted and how scientists at different parts of the world have interacted and how that's been thought about by historians and politicians and that sort of thing. But before we get into that, I want to give our special guest, Alex, a chance to introduce himself because this is his first time on the podcast.
Hi, I'm Alex Antrobus. I'm a South African living in London at the moment, doing a PhD at the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit at UCL. I also have the pleasure of being a founding member of the Ibro Simons Computational Neuroscience in Bizo, which is a summer school in computational neuroscience that happens in South Africa every January and is the first of its kind on the continent, really. And yeah, it's been going for the last 2 years and we're about to have our third in Bizo this January.
Great. So for this topic, we read a somewhat strange collection of papers. The first of which is A History of Universalism, Conceptions of the Internationality of Science from the Enlightenment to the Cold War. And that is by Gert Somsen from the journal Minerva in 2008. And we also read The Global Turn in the History of Science from Fatih Fan, and that's from 2012, and The Development of Global Science. And the first author on that piece is Kyle Cordova, and that's from 2015. So this is a smattering of papers about the history of globalism in science, and then the last one is a bit more modern piece and a kind of forward-looking piece written by scientists about the concept of global science. So I guess I can start by kind of describing my motivation for wanting to do this topic. Basically, I feel like I've noticed a lot of efforts lately for scientists who are practicing in Western countries to go to other parts of the world and to engage the local communities in scientific conferences or schools. I've seen a lot of this more on the kind of machine learning side of things. There's this thing called the Deep Learning Indaba, and this is like a meeting of deep learning scientists, and it's held in Africa, and it's includes people who are doing that work in Africa, and also people from outside Africa come to it. It's also the case that a machine learning conference, ICLR, is going to be in Africa in 2020 for the first time. And yeah, there's just kind of like a lot of these efforts to make sure that different parts of the world have access to the modern academic atmosphere that a lot of us take for granted in the West. There's also a lot of universities that are opening up branches in the Middle East or in China to kind of bring together different countries. So I saw that happening, and I was kind of curious about what the history of global interaction between scientists is, because there is kind of a dominant view, and the papers that we read talk about this kind of dominant view as scientific enlightenment and things being something that happened in Europe and then they're spreading, but clearly over the history there's been a lot of different perspectives on how scientists interact and the relationship that science has to politics and foreign relations and that kind of thing. So that's what I was interested in and tried to find some papers to read on that topic.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things. So you mentioned that you think this is happening particularly in machine learning. I happen to know that the guys behind the Deep Learning Indaba are also South African, and I met up with them a few times before they started that, and we kind of swapped ideas and swapped experience. But machine learning is an interesting one because I think there's a couple of things that have lent the kind of field. So machine learning is a very new field in terms of academic disciplines. It's exploded in the last 15 years, a decade, and what's really lent it to being really engageable for people from other countries, or particularly I always think of it from the point of view of countries that have fewer resources, is that there's such a strong culture of open publishing in machine learning. So really, machine learning, people kind of don't care about journals. It really, like, if it gets on the archive and the idea works in people's implementations, long before it's in a journal, the paper's got street cred. And so this is all accessible, and you combine that with the fact that, well, you know, it basically comes down to code. If you've got any machine, you can write some of the code. If you need heavy lifting like GPUs and that kind of stuff, you can increasingly do that on the cloud. If you can get cloud time donated to you or credit and that kind of thing. So this really leaves it open for young, smart people from all sorts of parts of the world who can understand the math, understand the stats, understand the code to get involved in some degree.
How much do you think that open publishing is kind of an enabler?
I think it's a big contributor because, you know, if you look at what universities or well-resourced universities spend on access to journals, like many universities just don't have that. And then you add on that universities in low-resource countries just can't afford that, first of all. And then second of all, I think increasingly you've got a large proportion of people who are able to kind of take part in those fields. They're mentally able to take part in those fields, but they just don't have the financial resources to even be in a university. So maybe they did an undergrad, maybe they got funded for a PhD, but they just cannot afford to sit around for a postdoc, right? The resources are not there in their country to sustain a family or anything. So they get out and they go into industry. But if they can access journals and stuff like that, then whatever time they can spend, they can continue to kind of grow their field. So I think this really is important.
Yeah, and there's just so many like YouTube video tutorials and stuff. Like I've needed to learn machine learning concepts and have been able to do it kind of completely independent of the fact that I'm affiliated with the university, just because so much is out there. Another thing that I've heard related to the push to bring machine learning into different communities is just because the problems that machine learning can solve are varied, but you know, the exact problems that an individual country or community has will be particular to their circumstances. So you want people who are actually from the area, who have domain-specific knowledge of a problem that machine learning can help with, to have the machine learning skills that they could apply to their own community's problems, rather than just having another country come in and assume that they kind of know the specifics of the problem enough to be able to solve it. Why not have people from the community learn how to solve problems with machine learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is true. I also think, you know, so some of these things have been true of other fields too. You know, I come from an applied math physics background, and that kind of thing was true there. You know, you could often access a lot of papers online. You could, if you came up with a cool idea in theory, you could write simulations at a simple level to implement them. But machine learning also sits in the sweet spot where you kind of have that aspect to it, but then you also have the practical aspect that Grace just mentioned. So there is there's this potential to say like, hey, I don't really understand this thing, but I can implement it to solve local relevant problems. So yeah, you combine those things, and it's a very, I mean, I'm always amazed at how popular machine learning is already on the African continent. When I speak to young people who are applying for our summer school, when I see their applications and I see what they're choosing to focus on during their kind of honors and master's level research.
Okay, so should we get into some of the history that we read about in this History of Universalism? So, as just a broad overview of what this paper is about, it is about the concept of, you know, is science universal? Is it the case that people from any country kind of have the same shared science? That's part of what they're talking about, but they're also talking just about how scientists have interacted and how they've viewed science in terms of their own national identity. So periods where people have been more nationalistic, how has that affected science and scientists? So I guess the place where it really starts is with this Republic of Letters from the early modern period. This is kind of a way that science was viewed at that time, and I had to look up when the early modern period was. That's the kind of non-historian I am. And so it's from 1500 to 1800. So this Republic of Letters, the idea is that they're, you know, scientists and learned men of the time were meant to come together in a cosmopolitan way that went across country boundaries. You know, people who had the philosophical scientific outlook were in this shared community, this shared republic, and so they should kind of act that way and not be focused on nationalistic divides. That was kind of the mindset of this republic at that time.
And they say while it was primarily European men, people like Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson were included, but women and Jews and other minority groups were generally not included.
Yes, it really was learned men. It was not learned women. Yes, and basically non-Christian, I guess, was not allowed.
Well, they said sometimes people from Morocco and Libya could come. So I don't know exactly what the religious affiliations, but it was presumably like swanky, wealthy people of the time who were, let's say, predominantly men and, yeah, could travel around Europe by their own means, right? This would have been certainly a requirement.
They called them savants, and that was another thing I had to look up because I'm not used to the term savant outside of like the more pathological use of it, but apparently it just means a learned man.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the author tries to make this point about how this kind of these men of letters as such kind of consider themselves above everyday functioning of citizens of the world. So one of the things he points out is this idea that that Thomas Cook and Alexandre Guy Pingret even received assistance from enemy naval officers. The idea being that if you're men of honor or men of intellect, this kind of supersedes the fact that you're at war with each other. And I think he's trying to stress that because he then goes to kind of contradict that with how things, the dynamics
how they later turn out. Yeah,
how they later turned out. But I do think that's kind of a funny, entertaining concept.
Yeah, and like, especially comparing this to where things go after this, I was really rooting to go back to the Republic of Letters time, the Cosmopolitan
when
time.
you would have been excluded from the scientific conversation, right?
I don't want countries to be at war with each other in scientific ways either, so it's a complicated question. And then the thing that disrupts this semi-harmonious time seems to be the French Revolution and the patriotism that came out of that enveloped, pride about scientific advancements in it as well. You had government officials awarding scientists and highlighting their achievements in a way that, made it seem like this is a pride of the French nation that we have scientists that can do this, and scientific advancements became part of, national advancements and nationalism.
Yeah, well, I think one of the key points he makes is how I think particularly Napoleon's rise to power intimately linked military victory with scientific success and basically technology. And Napoleon's great strength initially was that he really mastered the art of artillery, and this allowed him. This was his strength for a long time. And Napoleon totally revamped how tertiary education happens in France. He founded the ENS. And these types of organizations, because I think he appreciated the importance of scientific and technological advantage in war. So, yeah.
And I guess even without, just as a sort of tourist in Paris, when you look at the Eiffel Tower, you see actually the names of a bunch of famous scientists and engineers on there, which was, I don't know, like something that I sort of stumbled upon and wasn't necessarily expecting. But it's interesting to see how, for quite a long time, this was built slightly later, obviously, but there's a sense that nations definitely take pride, and they take pride in a sort of very clearly nationalistic way over the sort of intellectual accomplishments of the people who they've produced. And I think it's interesting because we're all relatively young and sort of born after the area, what has historically felt like the era of rampant nationalism when countries are like overtly at war with each other. But there is, I think now we'll sort of gradually get to the more present era, but it does feel like in the present era frequently it's more subtle, and sort of the influence of corporations is something that's talked about more, but the countries frequently aren't taking as much overt nationalistic pride in it. So there's something interesting and kind of peculiar to me about looking at giant sculptures or artifacts that sort of make very clear a country's nationalistic ideas about the people that are produced.
Yeah, I feel like, I guess I wouldn't necessarily expect like the overt nationalism about science to be seen today, but at the same time, so they talk about how At this point, after the French made scientific nationalism a thing, like at first scientists in other countries were not in favor of that, but they kind of succumbed to it. And Charles Babbage, who is famous in the history of computer science, wrote a piece on the decline of science in England. You kind of see that today, like certain countries will talk about how, they're losing face in the scientific realm and urging the government to fund science more. And I feel like that puts scientists in a weird position, like modern scientists in a weird position, because if I can get more funding for basic science by like telling my congressperson that the pride of the nation is at stake, like I might do that, but I don't really want to perpetuate the belief that it feels like scientists of the world are playing like a con against their own governments to make them pretend that we're all at war at each other, like that scientists want their nation to be the best, when really we just want the funding for science everywhere to go up. It's like you have to pretend that it's adversarial when it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely true to some extent. I think there are domains that pertain to national security, some in the ML areas, where people now are very commonly talking about how it's a problem if there's some country that is of sort of dubious alliance with like a big Western nation that is going to invest large amounts of money in machine learning or AI, and people feel, or people at least, and I can't tell how much this is. I think it depends on where people are in the political spectrum to some extent and what they believe to be the reality. But I think contemporary science is very much a hybrid of people who kind of believe that it's great if anyone anywhere is doing excellent science, and people who to some extent are actually honestly concerned about their country doing the best science. And so that's kind of it produces a weird tension in the way people talk about science, because I agree with you, people do try to play into the sort of insecurities of their nation's politicians to incite them to spend more tax dollars on that country's science. But I think the motivations can actually be more sincere. Like sometimes people are really afraid of what other countries are going to be capable of, it seems like.
Yeah, maybe I'm just hanging around with a more peaceful crowd who don't express that kind of concern.
Well, I mean, I think these concerns are valid, right? I mean, there's the connection between scientific advancement, therefore, and the resulting technological advancement, and this effect on your military power is really clear for everyone to see. I think what are interesting questions here, and this is kind of jumping ahead in many ways, but what the interesting questions are, how much control does the scientific community internationally have over that? So, for example, we are from totally different countries, and we are all living in the same country now, which is none of our home countries, and we're working in similar environments. And how important do we think it is that if we show solidarity in our research, like insisting on sharing it with each other, insisting on doing it together, this means it doesn't singularly belong to any one of our governments per se. And if we show that kind of solidarity, does this make it harder for governments to leverage these things against each other, as opposed to going underground and doing your research for your Department of Defense and not sharing it with colleagues? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're going to get to this point soon, but there have been clear cases in history where cultures of science took that turn, right? So around the Second World War, particularly, countries became very protectionist over certain traits of research.
Because they were literally at war.
They were literally at war, yeah, sure, they were literally at war. But yeah, it's interesting to see how much countries try and preserve that in periods that are not all-out war. And I just think what's interesting question for us as scientists.
Yeah,
is,
absolutely.
How much of a stance do we take on that, and do we carry that stance into periods of extreme pressure?
Okay, so let's go back to where we were in the timeline.
Back to the 1800s, maybe early 1900s.
Yeah, okay.
Still 1800s.
Right, so French Revolution instigated this period of nationalism in many different countries. I think they pointed out the Netherlands as particularly picking up on this. They talked about Dutch chemistry and the idea that, the Dutch personality is well suited for science because they are patient and dispassionate. So that was an example of really affiliating a country with science.
To quote, it's dispassionate, patient, precise, and persevering.
And they also talk about Germany and German scientists using the notion that science is unifying and universal to bring their own country together, but not in a way that was external to the country. And this is a thing that kind of a theme that gets brought up a lot is when you say it's universal, who's included in that? At times saying science is European is very exclusionary. At other times, it's really, bringing all of Europe together, which is a lot of people. So this notion of is science universal is complicated because it depends on what universe you're looking at.
Yeah, I got to admit, I find that term a little bit confusing at first, because when somebody says to me science is universal, I think of it as if I do an experiment in Turkey or South Korea, it's going to come out the same way. Although we were just talking tonight
Which
about...
is like the principle of universality? Or something?
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Science,
In physics, the principle of universality. But yeah, I guess this is more from a cultural point of view and from an access point of view, right? Like, how accessible is it?
Although they did very quickly in the introduction to this paper make some claim that there have been studies that what counts as proof and evidence and truth, it varies by culture, and kind of like winked towards the notion that, even the very basics of science aren't universal, but I don't think most scientists would find that convincing, I think.
Unless you're talking about like social sciences or psychology or something.
Well, if the culture that you're studying is changing, then the results may change. But just kind of like the principles of logic, presumably, are somewhat universal. But right, so after this period, they talk about how there was kind of a new type of internationalism, and they compare it to the Olympics, where, in the Olympics, each nation is its own team and everyone's competing against each other, but kind of by the mere fact that everyone comes together to compete, you're displaying some sort of international unity. And they were speaking of science in the same way. Science and scientists would be nationalistic, and they'd want to have the best science done in their country, and they would claim that the best science is being done in their country. But they have a statement that, you could only judge a nation's science by international standards. So you had to be in contact with other nations and comparing yourself to them. And in this way, there was some kind of unity, like a playful competition, potentially. Although I don't know how playful people actually viewed it.
And so then this was in the follow-up to World War I? This is what they're talking about?
I think this precedes, the First World War. We
Sorry.
haven't quite got to that disaster yet.
Yeah, they were talking about at the end of the 1800s, like 23 international scientific unions had cropped up and was an example of this kind of Olympian attitude.
And I guess this is when there were all these like world expositions as well, right? This was like an era. I mean, this is when the Eiffel Tower was actually built, right? During this era of, I guess, competitive celebration of national science. So there were a bunch of world fairs and world expositions in the late 1800s and early 1900s.
I actually found this, I understand what they're saying, but I also find it hard to understand how the Olympics are unifying. That's just something that I've always felt. People always point to the Olympics as, a good example of international unity. And I feel like if you were there and you had people from different countries interacting with each other, you would feel it. But to watch it, it seems so much like you're cheering on your country against other countries. It doesn't feel good to me.
I don't know. I think there's something, kind of getting back to the World Fair idea. In these days, in the days in which these expositions were happening, people would travel for months to countries that they otherwise wouldn't have gone to, right? You had Americans who hadn't left America going to Europe to specific cities where they would go to a fair for a couple months or something like this, and vice versa. And I, to me, it at least seems like, from what I've heard about this era, there was, in some sense, the cultures had been isolated, and so there was sort of distinctness amongst the nations, but at the same time, people were more mobile and more able to get places due to advances in like steam transportation, like so steamships and things like this, which presumably made it in some ways feel a bit closer. So it was what they're talking about are the people who were going to these different kinds of places to experience the culture of a nation and interact with its innovations.
Yeah, and I think jumping back to the present again. We saw the same thing with North and South Korea, right? In this most recent Winter Olympics, that it really can make a difference. I think even if not everyone's there, it was such a novelty to see groups of North Korean fans supporting their team, and it was amazing to see North Korean cheerleaders hanging out with South Korean cheerleaders and things. This was kind of a very, even though it's kind of a small step practically, I think it does have a big effect that people around the world could see that on TV, and it was just this moment of actually just the same as us, right? The politics has really skewed our perception of these other countries. So I think it can, because it's so emotive, really, it can get under the skin of even politicians, right, and make them speak.
Maybe it depends on like what your perspective is. If you're like some sort of intellectual, globalist humanist like already, you're gonna look at this and think, why are the countries competing with each other?
Is that you making fun of me?
But if you're like coming at it from like a weird hawkish neoconservative perspective, then
it might warm your heart.
I guess, yeah.
I mean, I don't know, man. We just got a foosball table in our lab, and people are bonding over the competition in foosball. I'm saying you can form close bonds in sportsmanship.
All right. If you can't tell, I never played sports.
I was gonna say I totally sound like the jock in the room right now.
So after this, bonding competition period, that's when World War I came around. And it seemed like the thing that really broke the community was not just that there were, German scientists who were potentially contributing to Germany's military tactics, but it seemed like it was that there was a letter that was written that a bunch of academics signed that claimed that Germany wasn't committing the war crimes that it was committing, and that. A lot
of German academics, just to be.
Yeah, German academics claiming that Germany wasn't committing the war crimes it was committing, and academics in other countries saw that, and it was like the blatant disregard of truth that really broke their hearts and was like, okay, you guys are not part of the academic scientific community anymore because you have given up our core value of seeking truth.
Yeah, I mean, you're giving up the core value of honesty, basically, right? And integrity, which is so fundamental in science.
And so then in the aftermath of World War I, there was this International Research Council set up, and Germany was not allowed to be a part of it. And it was interesting to see kind of Germany's response was like, okay, we accept that, we've lost the war, and so we're not political leaders, we're not military leaders right now, but we still think that we're scientific leaders. And so at that point in time, it felt to me like they were willing to pretend that those things are separate, but during the war, they conflated them and were doing kind of scientific misdeeds and lying about things as scientists when it suited them during the war, but then after the war they wanted to pretend that these are easily separable and they should be able to be a part of the research council because they still do good science.
Yeah, it's interesting. So they have a quote here from Fritz Haber, but he was this famous German chemist who, I believe, did he win a Nobel Prize, I think, maybe for developing a process that allowed them to make ammonia, I think it was.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah, I think, which then resulted in the manufacture of TNT and all sorts of things. But he was also behind the development of chlorine gas warfare.
Yeah, so
for the Germans.
He did win the Nobel Prize for this. Yeah. And I mean, but the synthesis of ammonia is also
Fritz Haber process, isn't it?
Correct. The Haber-Bosch process.
Haber-Bosch process. Sorry.
But the synthesis of ammonia is also used for fertilizer. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
So that was the breakthrough from an agricultural point of view. Really, I think that's what the prize was for, and it resulted in many other things, as things often do in science. But he was an interesting character because he, I think, was extremely driven by what other people thought of him, and he got extremely kind of egotistical after winning these prizes, and he became viciously patriotic during the First World War, to the point that he would he would intentionally visit the front to see his inventions in action and see how they performed.
So this was, World War I was famous for chemical warfare.
Yeah, basically. Exactly. So he would kind of go and want to be the first or second person to launch one of these shells, for example. Like that's the degree
which is super creepy.
It's right? very creepy. I listened to a kind of interesting short biography about him the other day, and to the point that he totally eroded his relationship with his wife and everything. Very, very creepy character.
I guess the next thing that they talk about as being relevant to these kinds of viewpoints is Needham and Sarton are these two people who kind of pushed to, again, bring things together. It feels like Sarton started this publication called ISIS, and it was meant to publish kind of international science and highlight how international science is. But I feel like the way they described it, it was still kind of in a way of each nation is different. So he talks about Arab meteorology and
Arab mineralogy.
Arab mineralogy and
Japanese algebra and Hindu geometry.
So it's kind of a step in the right direction, but it doesn't quite feel like the type of internationalism that we would speak of today. But this other guy, Needham, seems like he was a little bit more in the realm of saying, science is this kind of basic core thing that all civilizations have and use, and it's just it's universal to human nature. That was his way of bringing people together in the realm of science.
As an aside at this point, we'll probably get to this later, but this is kind of relevant to something that's been a big talking point in a lot of South African universities lately, and I'd say more broadly universities on the African continent, although I think other countries had this conversation quite a lot earlier than we did. And this is this concept of decolonizing our education system. So our education systems are built 100% designed on the education systems of the European nations that colonized our countries, and there's a lot of conversation going on do we want our institutions to be built this way, and if not, what do we want? And there's this argument of decolonizing things. And in the humanities, it's never straightforward, but in the humanities it's a little bit more straightforward in the sense you want more reading materials and more subject work to be written by African authors, etc. How do you decolonize science? So this has been quite an interesting, tricky point, and one kind of thread that has come through that I've heard about a lot is just this idea of really trying to emphasize what science did happen on the African or just non-European continent. So particularly a lot of ancient math was developed in non-European parts of the world. And this may or may not be relevant to your research right now today, but I think it's an important history from a national point of view, right? And just from a kind of integrity point of view. People care a lot about it now.
Yeah, and it does seem like in another paper that we read that these two people, Needham and Sarton, were they made these points, and then we'll get into how those points were kind of forgotten and covered up, and then rediscovered more recently with the idea of decolonizing and post-colonial studies that have cropped up in the 80s and 90s. So these two people kind of formed the seeds that maybe later on were rediscovered by academics and relate to the position that people are in today in thinking about these things. The thing I was surprised by is at least in the storyline as it's laid out here, H.G. Wells playing a surprisingly important role in the view of science and nationalism. So he was claiming that people get indoctrinated by governments and politicians, and if they were trained to be more scientific instead and, given just objective facts rather than biased viewpoints, that the world would just be a lot better, a more efficient place, a more fair and equal place.
Yeah, so what do you guys think of Wells's comment or concept that the progress of science was directly coupled to the regress of nationalism?
I like it, but I don't know if it's true. Because during wartime, a lot of science gets done.
Yeah, so. There's honestly, at least in the version of history of science that I know, it does seem like significant strides to get made during wartime, and it does seem like that's partly because people are willing to spend very large amounts of money on stuff. So it's not that it's needed. I think actually the Olympic model is an interesting one, because I think actually it's in some ways a way of that sort of more friendly competition is a way of inciting politicians to spend as much money as they might for more honestly competitive activities. And so I don't necessarily think that this is ideal from my perspective, but I mean, if you think about the balanced incentives, I mean, in long lulls where there isn't conflict across nations, what drives science is consumerism and sort of the spending by corporations to some extent, I think.
Yeah, technology probably.
Technology for consumer applications or
Yeah.
for industrial processes or things like this. But there do seem to be certain other kinds of technology that boom maybe in and around wartime. So like, developments related to radar or telecommunications in part have been facilitated by wartime spending where like basically a bunch of smart people get channeled into those areas because they're useful in those settings. Computing in some ways partly emerged out of World War II code breaking. There's lots of settings like this where certain needs happen in war that are different and distinct from the needs that like during normal civilian science you would get. And they're not always like, even if the immediate motivations might be less than desirable, sometimes just that sort of it shakes people out of thinking a certain way and produces some innovation. Not a good justification for war, obviously, but interesting consequence.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of historical evidence that in times of war, scientific progress can accelerate immensely, right? It's just interesting, though. I do think I wouldn't maybe phrase it the same way he says, that the progress of science is directly coupled to the regress of nationalism, but more that rise in nationalism does often, at least temporarily, seem to result in a regress of science, I think. So, or could result in a regress of science. So all-out war is one thing, right? But right now in Britain and Europe in general, we're experiencing a bit of a rise in nationalism, and there's been a lot of outcry from the scientific community about how this will affect scientific collaboration, the ability for talented students and people to move between nations, the ability for resources to be shared between nations, will trans-EU projects continue, etc., etc. So I 100% agree with you on the idea that, in all-out war, everyone's all hands on deck and quite a lot of progress often gets made. In that interim period of the rise of nationalism, I often think there is probably a bit of a dent put in science.
I agree with you that in eras where there's sort of populist nationalism, it seems like maybe there isn't as much scientific progress being made, but often, to some extent, it feels like those are after economic booms, and there's usually like an economic decline that maybe precipitates populist.
Yeah.
So you're saying you can't separate the lull in science, like it could be caused by an economic decline as well?
Yeah, there could be a common cause. To me, it seems like, if I think back to a few eras that I'm thinking over the last 2 centuries.
Yeah, I think that's quite...
It does seem like when there are economic depressions, there's not war. There's little scientific progress perhaps being made relative to other times. And people become more populist. But it's kind of the shared cause is there's an economic recession.
The other paper we read talks about circulation as a concept in the history of science and explaining how things influence each other and just kind of having open routes of communication for people and things to pass through. So I do think, though, that if populist nationalism is combined with the closing of borders to people and things, that will still have long-term effects on science insofar as science depends on the movement of people and things. Right, so then there's communism.
Boom. Yeah, I think it's interesting here. So he talks about in the 1930s this formation of the scientific left in Britain. And so he outwardly calls, communist scientists like Bernard Needham and J.B.S. Haldane. And I think this is interesting because now he's pointing at clear economic principles along which scientists align themselves. And you definitely see this today, right? Working in the kind of machine learning field, I find it interesting that you could often separate people along the lines of guys who are in machine learning and believe machine learning is a great opportunity for big corporates to earn even more money and have more power, and for them to kind of join that bandwagon. I would describe these people
programmers.
Yeah. like code bros.
Yeah.
Like not all of them, but I'd say like it's interesting that some of them I would describe as economically conservative machine learning researchers, right? Like their view on economics is conservative, so like
they might as well be working at a hedge fund or a
exactly. Like they're more likely to end up working at a hedge fund.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. Like I've got the skill, it gives me an advantage. Let's leverage this as much as we can. And then you've totally got the other kind of left side of the same. Guys did the same course, came out of the same program, but they got a totally different attitude to it. Like I've got these skills. How can I like spend a certain number of hours a day writing enough macros for our companies to pay off like my bills, and then spend the rest of my time building apps for like the benefit of society. I'm making a caricature now for expression, but I think it's kind of interesting because he hits that point now, and I think you see this very alive and well in our community right now, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, out of this idea that that like H.G. Wells was talking about, and that we see today, that you can use the tools of science for good. You can build technology and do engineering that makes society better. That's what these communists were drawing on. There was even one of them, Bernal, says science is communism, and the Soviet Union was the like model scientific society. In this like part of this paper, it did seem like there was a lot of throwing in or assuming of the type of ideals that are associated with science. Like I think they claim like, oh yeah, socialism and science had in common the desire to alleviate human misery. And like, I don't like human misery, but I wouldn't say that it's a scientific ideal to alleviate human misery. And so it seemed like there was a conflation of both like science and technology, or science with engineering, when you could arguably separate those things, and also science with certain ideals and values that we would normally consider, science isn't allowed to talk about values. It's supposed to talk about facts. So this was a period where it seems like a lot of these things were getting wrapped up together.
Yeah, I mean, I would say essentially all these issues are issues of human principles and human beliefs and whatever kind of personal and national ethics people display. Science is just, are you a scientist? And scientists are subject to the same views and opinions and political orientations as anyone else. They just happen to be scientists. So that's really what all of these papers are talking about at the end of the day, right? Is the scientific community in the world at that time more a non-nationalist, all-encompassing community, or are they more nationally focused, and why and when, and does it benefit or does it hinder the science itself?
So after World War II, that's where we're at now, there was this big meeting called Science and the World Order. And I think it was here where it was talked about, again, the Germans violating scientific norms because they were expelling Jewish scientists, and they were advocating for Aryan physics. So they were being rebuffed by the international scientific community. But then this was also a point where the concept of science as European was used in a way that was meant to be unifying, because obviously Europe had just, destroyed itself. And to claim science as a European ideal, universally European, was meant kind of as a healing phrase, not necessarily to be exclusionary to other parts of the world. Einstein, I guess, even wrote a letter about, Europe's history and the role of science in Europe. So they were, like, you could argue that the scientific community was trying to bring things back together by unifying scientists. But this is where things really get interesting to me, because in the 50s, when countries like the US were very anti-communism, they were trying to shut down this view of the Soviet Union and its relationship to science and to engineering. And it seems like this is the point at which the Enlightenment and the euro-centric view of science was really solidified in the history of science. That's what this paper made it seem like. That historians of science, history of science was developing and becoming a codified field with research departments in universities. And at this time, the historians were saying this certain period of time is when real science happened, because this was science, not necessarily tied to applications or engineering or technology. This kind of Enlightenment era science that was real science, and that was the birth of it. And anything that came before that, like in the Middle Ages, that was just like preparation for this moment, and anything that comes after is just elaboration. And the things that came before were the things that happened in the Islamic world and in the Middle East and in China, and the things that came after were things that happened in Russia and the US and Japan, but in that moment that they highlight as the moment, most things were happening in Europe. And so it was their decision at that point as a reaction against communism and the Soviet Union that centered Europe and that moment in time as kind of what science is.
Which so this is an interesting one to me because it feels like in the contemporary moment it's more many countries either rely on a storied past or are more future looking and sort of in some ways envious of larger corporations, which mostly, I mean, to some extent have not arisen in Europe as much as like there are many large American corporations and many large Asian corporations, fewer large European corporations, maybe due to, I don't know, regulations that prevent the production of giant corporations. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so we basically just in the timeline just crossed the Second World War, right? Which was also, I think, very interesting because it's one of the biggest examples of mass scientific exodus from one continent to another, basically, and a shift in power that's never really been reversed, right? I mean, the US, while probably already competitive, really became the powerhouse of science and scientific research, I think, basically from the Second World War. And a huge amount of that was scientists moving from Europe across the US and never really going back. And places like Germany, which were particularly like the University of Göttingen, which was like an epicenter of mathematical progress in most of the 19th century, lost that title and never regained it, kind of thing. So this really was kind of a real turning point in terms of where science was principally done on the planet.
So I guess before wrapping up this paper, one anecdote that I thought was funny is when I was recently at a robotics conference a couple months ago in Madrid, the king decided to show up to the robotics conference. And while some people in attendance, like some conference goers, seemed to think this was entertaining, many were, including myself, were partly just annoyed because they really, really amped up security on the day when the king was there, and it was like took hours to get into the conference center. And if I don't know, if you've been to a conference, the idea of waiting in line for 2 hours on the morning of to get into the building of a conference is like very abnormal and would not be something that would be, I mean, it's like super inconvenient on the day of a conference. But then we were there and the king gave a speech at this, as like part of the inauguration, which in some ways, again, was like charming, and some people thought, oh, this is cool. But in other ways, it's like the king was sort of using it as a propaganda moment to like talk about how great Spain is and how important it is for like world robotics. And it's interesting because that was honestly, and perhaps this just speaks to my naivete, but this was like honestly the first time I thought like, wow, it's a big deal like for a conference to be in a city in a certain country. Like it is the case that many conferences are in the US, and so I just take it sort of for granted that like, yeah, conferences kind of go wherever. They're sometimes in the US, they're sometimes in Europe. I mean, I wasn't so naive as to realize, yes, there are clearly whole places in the world, like the continent of Africa, where conferences rarely go. And I mean, I had thought about this before as well. But it was weird to see a country such as Spain.
Yeah. What I always think so weird about those occasions is that, like, I mean, I know science is a human endeavor, so it's always subject to bias and all that kind of stuff. But we like to think that, you know, if you're a hard enough working student and you can solve the problems and you can answer the questions and pass the tests, you can move forward, right? And you can end up in those places. So whenever I'm in a scientific community, I always like to think this is mostly a meritocracy, like more so than a lot of other places in the world. And there you are receiving a talk by a guy who's got that position for doing precisely nothing, right? For coming out of the right vagina.
Yeah.
Like, that is how he got that position.
He was very tall and had a very lovely beard.
Oh, okay. The beard...
maybe beard, earned it a little.
Okay, yeah, the beard maybe makes it legit. But I just, yeah.
Also not something
so
he had control over, having a beard or being tall.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, some of us can't grow great beards like Josh's.
That paper also has this quote from the Crown Prince of the Netherlands, where he said, "Science is an important bearer of the social and cultural identity of Europe that distinguishes itself from other societies and earlier cultures by its rationality." And that was in 2006. So you could argue that these sort of nationalistic or European-centric views of science, yes, are still very much around today.
Yeah, I mean, that was also another element of it, which I didn't really highlight. But the idea that a king would come to a conference of scientists, of international scientists, and turn it into, like, even in the slightest, kind of distort it towards a sort of pro-Spain PR event, it just struck me as, like, weird and counter to the spirit of it. I mean, somehow that did feel to me like it was irritating to me, kind of. Like, that there was an injection of nationalism into what I kind of just consider to be like a fairly global event. Like, conferences occur, I understand, not all around the world right now, not uniformly over the landmass, but it does feel like they occur in many major places. And the idea that someone would sort of exploit that, because it does feel, I mean, I'm not like so, again, I'm not so naive about this, but it does feel like it kind of, reigns a little on what I otherwise think of as it's kind of awesome that science occurs as internationally as it does. And sure, in the future it will be more international and that will be better. But it's the wrong direction to pull it back in and say let's celebrate each country for its weird nationalistic particularity and how great it is relative to the other countries.
So you're not in favor of the Olympic view. You want the Republic of Letters.
I mean,
with the non-sexist.
Yeah, I want the sort of progressive Republic of Letters, but I also the Olympic model for science. Part of that is to help kind of motivate the people who don't get it to fund science. So either there's people who are not actively engaged in science, and politicians can be kind of fans of their team in some abstract sense.
Yeah, and I think also politicians and leaders can be humble about it. So you can stand up there and say we are honored to have your conference here. We're honored that you all came and took part. This is the resources we've deployed lately because we'd like to see this grow. This is different from standing up and saying we are the shiz when it comes to robotics. Yeah, and especially when you're not part of the robotics community explicitly. I think there's ways and means about these things. When I was young, I took part in maths Olympiads. Yeah. And these things I think are great, right? Kids get to go all over the world and compete at math, but actually the competition is sure intense, but basically kids just make great friends.
So I think that's the sort of optimistic view of it, and I think presenting it that way, that's the real motivation in some sense. And I don't want to be totally bashing on the King of Spain, which would be
sorry, Spain. You have nothing against Spain.
Yeah, no, and
great beards.
It's not clear to me that he was poorly motivated in this. They were trying to say let's make Spain great at robotics or something, and we want Spain to be on the world stage. But it was balanced against but this is mostly a global thing, and obviously Spain isn't Spain is only partly represented here, and there's people from all over the world.
Well, I would argue that actually being from certain countries like the US or Britain, I feel like you overestimate how international science is because you're working at the places that people from all across the world come to. When I was in grad school in New York, I don't think Americans were the majority of the postdoc population in the neuroscience department. And so it looks like things are already well integrated from the perspective of the places that everyone wants to go to. But if you go to a place that has less prestige, it doesn't look as international there because people don't fight to get there, and it has more locals. So how well science has become integrated and international very much depends on where you're looking from. And I lived in Germany for a year, but again, that research center wasn't mostly Germans. It was the type of place where people from all over come to work. Certain places make it seem like we're farther along than we actually are.
So I think I should help Grace out here and pull us back to our agenda of progress. So you were saying how kind of in the 40s, maybe going to the 50s, this is when kind of historians of science started to really stamp the science as a European creation narrative. And so there's this quote they have here from Butterfield that says, "The scientific revolution we must regard as a creative product of the West, depending on a complicated set of conditions which existed only in Western Europe." I always think this is interesting because it also it has this context of saying we've got here, we've solved science, and the guys who got here were Western Europe. But if we'd taken the exact same assessment in the Middle Ages, we were making the exact same statement about the Arab world, or maybe what was then Chinese Empire or something like this a little bit earlier. Like, different scientific revolutions have happened at different times, and they've been in different parts of the world. The one we are living through right now is quite clearly happened, well, a significant part of it has happened in what we now call the Western world. And yeah, it's just like kind of, it's got that taste of like, cool, evolution's finished, we're the optimal kind of thing. It's just
Yeah.
like, there's so much more to go, guys. There's so much more to go.
Well, maybe that can bring us to, I think, the last paper, because I think there weren't that many unique points so much in the second paper that we read, and it was written more with an eye towards an audience of historians, kind of how they should think about things. So with the time remaining, I think I want to talk about the paper that was focusing on mentoring and how we should have more international mentorship programs. So this was the Development of Global Science paper. So yeah, they kind of highlight the issues that we know of, things like brain drain, where people from countries that don't have established scientific traditions and universities will go to the West and will kind of perpetuate this rich get richer thing where all the best people are in the same place, and then that furthers the idea that like the West is where good science is, but it's because the West is where good science is that's where good scientists go. And so how can you kind of bootstrap this so that you can start up new places that are centers of excellence in areas that didn't previously have them, and allow the local community to then create that scientific population there.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the motivating way of conceptualizing this to me is like, basically you have to play off people's desire to be amongst a community of other scientists against their desire for power. So like, if you are some young scientist and you go to some like hub of science and learn from some great scientists, you have the opportunity to like stay there and be like one of the guys or one of the gals, whatever. Or you can like leave and go back to some place where there's like no science and be like basically a colonist. I'm using that intentionally. And like start your own little outpost where you're like the big dog. And I guess the sort of trade-off, and I mean, this paper feels a little bit almost cloying to me. A lot of this is about like figuring out what incentives will get people to behave a certain way. And part of that is like, yeah, you like, in order to incentivize young, ambitious scientists to go abroad and start outposts, they need to be like given power and the ability to like have a bunch of resources at their command.
So, yeah, I mean, this is very much a thing, right? When I was leaving South Africa and many of my peers were getting into grad programs overseas, we all had this thought at the back of our mind. We discussed it often about how long are you going to go for? Are you just going to do your PhD? Are you going to come back? Do you have to leave to do a PhD? Why are we leaving to do our PhDs? When do you come back? All these questions. And I mean, I think a lot of us fight this internal battle where we basically perceive that if we leave the well-established institutions of the left, our careers will take, of the West, our careers will take a hit in some way. So yeah, you can maybe go back and start your own thing or be the big fish in the small pond, but will you fall off the bandwagon as a result? And yeah, it's a very, very difficult question, and it takes really strong people and really motivated people to take that leap. But I think this is where a couple of key things come in. So we mentioned the open access publications thing earlier. This is kind of key in that sense. Like, you don't want to move back anywhere where you feel like you are starving yourself from access to scientific knowledge, right? If you don't feel like that's part of the issue, cool. That's one less box you have to worry about, right? And yeah, international access to simulating resources. I mean, this is all very relevant for me. And sharing of data, right? This is also really a key thing. So for less resource countries, we're less likely to invest huge amounts of money in big experimental rigs, perhaps. We just don't really have the resources to throw at that. Maybe it's hard to motivate people to build those rigs there. But if we can share the data, we can, maybe benefit still from secondhand data and that kind of thing. And there are other things we can talk about later that, in fact, are increasingly giving less well-resourced countries a kind of advantage in some ways in even in experimental science.
The points that you've brought up are all, I think, like very clean and well thought through, and I think many of the sort of ideas overlap with those mentioned in the paper. The one thing that felt a little bit awkward about the way this paper framed them, to me, was how sort of, it almost felt very clinical. It's like, you're going to have a good relationship with your PI, who you worked with when you were, off in some epicenter. Now go back and sort of leverage that relationship to get young local students to feel more comfortable working for you, because they'll be able to hang in the shadow of this giant scientist off somewhere else who they won't really interact with.
Well, yeah, they do as a point of illustrating the powerful nature of mentoring. They show like a family tree in science, where you have a person and you have all of their PhD students, and then you have all of the PhD students of those people, and you can see how like one person can really end up influencing such a broad group of people. They put that in there as, something motivational and positive, but you could also argue that it's, a little strange in the model that they have it. They do say that it would be, there'd be some person who's very well established and has good resources, and that you wouldn't expect that person to directly go to another country and start something, but they may serve as a director on the board of maybe a new university or a new center, and they would encourage people from their, well-established university to go to this new center and then be the mentors for people there. So it would be like you're stemming from like a grandfather that you then send people off, and they find, their academic children there. And that's supposed to benefit the people there.
But it really does. I mean, we talked about colonialism before, or decolonization. And I do feel like this model is like weirdly like the kind of economic imperialism of earlier eras and still today.
So I think it's very important, like, where these people are coming from. I suppose in my mind, I'm picturing them being people who are native to country A, going to the epicenter, training up there and coming back.
Yeah.
In which case, I don't really think of it as a colonialism thing.
I don't think that this paper necessarily makes that point, but okay, I think that that's a good way to look at it, and that would make a lot of sense. The other point that I would make, though, is you could argue that if you honestly believe that science is universal, then you're not imposing your Western beliefs on these people. You're just bringing science, which they already have some form of, and you're all just connecting your universal science together.
Yeah, so the cynic in me, though, is saying that, like, they're using the pretense of the universality of science as a subtext in order to, like, extend the sort of influence of specific scientists. Like, if a major Western university opens a, outpost university, which many of them are doing, in a place that doesn't have its own kind of, like, intellectual heritage in terms of like science or something like this, right? Like they open like an outpost for science and engineering or something like this in some place that doesn't currently have a dominant university there. Yeah, they will send people maybe who were educated in the West at that major institution to that place to lead it, but it and even explicitly in this paper, it's partly motivated as it will extend the influence and scientific impact of the Western, directors who kind of run it. And so it feels kind of like an investment game almost. Like you're trying to build up this place, and it really is extending the scientific legacy of the specific founders who don't even go live there. They maybe give talks there every year or something like that. But
yeah, I think this is an interesting point, but I kind of see it in a slightly different light. So I increasingly feel, as an African who's probably going to go back to Africa at some point and practice most of my science there, I increasingly feel that, like, I'm kind of tired of the attitude of, like, begging the rest of the world to come and fix our science or to give us scientific resources. I increasingly think we need to look at it as an economic model and kind of say, like, we have really talented people and we can sell these skills just like anywhere else, right? And so big international companies are really getting on this. Like Amazon Web Services has their cloud computing development team in Cape Town. Google's opening a research center in Accra. DeepMind's opening, I think it's Google, right? Opening a research center in Accra. IBM's got centers in Johannesburg and Nairobi now. And I think what these guys are seeing, the guys who've got big capital and willing to risk it, they're seeing, like, there's really talented people there. Okay, there's some degree of uncertainty and instability, but you can pay those guys an order of magnitude salary less than I have to pay a bunch of guys in Silicon Valley, and they are still really good. And there's something to be gained there. Now, I'm not trying to say that this means you can just pay other people in the world way less. Those salaries are really good and competitive locally. And I think we should if we can train people who are competitive, and we can say to these other countries, like, okay, send us a couple of your experts, we'll provide people for them to work with. And then the hosting nations, their governments and their culture has a certain amount to say in this negotiation, right? Like, if you think of them as just rolling over and just accepting these institutions to come in and do what they want, then yeah, I totally agree with your sentiment, or I see how it could be problematic. But and that has happened plenty of times, unfortunately. But local governments, but local governments don't have to roll over, right? So Rwanda is a really interesting example of a place that's really embracing enthusiasm in their scientific growth, and their president's very outspoken about it and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's a happy middle ground, as there is with it should be a negotiated processes, basically, and both countries are offering something. I think it becomes better when you don't think of the less well-resourced country as begging or something, or just being...
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking about it from the standpoint of begging. And I think you're bringing up really good points, and I don't mean to undermine the value that both sides are getting. I see that. But when I think about how these decisions get made, it does feel like it's possibly to serve people in already quite privileged positions in large scientific epicenters, where they're either gaining some clear economic benefit or some...
Wait, no, what? If you're a professor who serves as a director on a board of a university in a different country, what are you actually gaining economically? Or are you just gaining, you're a better known scientist at the end? I don't actually know what they're gaining. What could be so cynical about it?
The sort of, I don't know, slightly skeptical image I have is a scientist is influential in starting an outpost of science somewhere, and then all of the jobs go to their former students, or something like this.
Well, maybe the first round jobs that populate that, but then the point is that they train up local people there. And then now they're entered into the global science community. I think maybe even a few years ago, if I had read this plan, I wouldn't have thought to flag it as potentially problematic. It's only because of this kind of recent trend of decolonizing and thinking about what are the weird ways in which things that happened a long time ago are still impacting things, that to me it's more of a vague threat of if NYU has a Shanghai branch. If NYU started opening up universities all over the world, would there be some weird effect later on because NYU is particular in some way that in the long term isn't good, and their model of academia got spread and became dominant, and there's problems as a result of that?
The concerns there are subtler concerns that I think, what I'm trying to say is that there does seem to be some connection between a professor maybe being willing or motivated to take shortcuts on the ethical considerations of where their research is spreading to. There are countries with repressive regimes that start schools or permit Western universities to start outpost schools in order to promote themselves, to get their students jobs, right? That kind of casualness, I think, can be disconcerting and can have social ramifications.
Yeah, I get your point. The idea that, if you are concerned about regimes in certain other parts of the world, should you be deploying resources from your country to those parts of the world to do scientific development, which those regimes in theory have access to? But I think there's two sides to this coin. In some ways, you can think of your scientists just going there, contributing to the progress of research and allowing these regimes to have access to it. But often, just having foreign nationals in those environments talking about, who are more likely to maybe raise issues about how problematic the regime is, or voice issues if they feel like the research is being pushed in a pathological direction or that kind of thing. Often the presence of those international people, those foreign nationals, creates that stir that makes local people start saying, hey, I don't like the way my regime is trying to control or trying to use my science.
I think we can at least say that the best version of this model could be quite beneficial. And yes, things can go poorly if, bad actors are involved or care isn't taken. But the general idea of connecting people that are well-established scientists with areas that don't have that as a resource seems potentially beneficial. But with that, I think we need to wrap up. So thank you, Alex, for sharing your ideas with us and your knowledge.
It's a pleasure, guys. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Till next time. Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.